Let's predict the 10.2 DPS for Mythic Plus meta. Will Augmentation still remain S tier after all of these nerfs? With all the class changes, reworks, tier sets, talent moved around, there are new things happening to shake up that tier list and see who's going to be dominating in the Mythic Plus for the Season 3. Starting off with Frost DK, and Frost DK is in an okay-ish situation with the addition of Chill Streak. Essentially, Mythic Plus Frost DK will do a little bit better than it has been doing so far. Now, just to preface this, all of the information that we have about all of the specs has come from a study I have done for over hundreds of logs of everybody doing Mythic Plus in the PTR. It is definitely not conclusive, and of course we're gonna keep having class tuning in the next couple of weeks, so if you're watching this video in the future, kind of try to put into perspective with all the buffs and nerfs that have happened since we've published this video. But until then, Frost DK is going to be in a solid B tier. Right now, in terms of overall performance, Frost DK is sitting at about 100k-ish overall DPS, which might not sound a lot, but because we are using PTR logs, you have to remember that in PTR we're essentially scaled at 440 item level, and I think in the first week it was even lower than that, which is lower than what we have on live right now. And this is from people mostly doing plus 20s, because we looked at 20s and higher keys in terms of the logs that we were able to find, and that's where Frost DK is. So still doing decent amount of damage, likely to be doing even more once more competent people will start to actually take Frost DK for a spin in the Mythic Plus. And similar with Frost Unholy is surprisingly close, but not really. In terms of overall damage, Unholy seems to be doing a little bit better than Frost, and it's overall in a better state because cooldowns like Army of the Deads have been nerfed and a lot of power has been put into the 45-second cooldown window, which makes Unholy fundamentally a way better spec in both rates, but specifically in Mythic Plus, where you want that, let's say, 1 minute burst window. And you can have that with Dark Transformation and Apocalypse, and it's amazing. We've tested it, and it was so cool to play Unholy on the PTR. Testing these specs on the PTR was fun for sure. So fun that sometimes I forgot to hit the record button. Yeah, there was supposed to be more gameplay for you to see. And to make sure I wasn't going to make that blunder again, I went into Outplayed and set its recording behavior to be for the full gaming session, so I can just have everything recorded regardless of how forgetful I am. Get your M+ or raid boss fights recorded, trim it in no time, save it or share it for the world to see. It's all super streamlined. Click the link in the description to download the app. It's free, it's easy to use, and you get great quality recordings out of it. It's honestly the best way to support the channel, and we are super grateful. Thank you Outplayed for sponsoring the video, and now let's see where Havoc ends up in 10.2. And boy did Havoc change, literally and figuratively, and literally mostly, because it did receive a rework. Now it's hard to kind of predict where Havoc is going to be, because we all know it's doing a little bit more damage on the PTR than it has to, so much so that we're kind of seeing it into S tier. Now, likely the numbers will be tuned, so it's not as much, or maybe just every other spec has to be buffed. But since Havoc is going to receive a rework, it's likely going to do a lot of damage, at least at the very beginning, because such is the nature of reworks. Pretty much every class that has seen a rework in the last couple of expansions, to any extent, mostly in Dragonflight of course, has risen to power. Even Ret, if you remember the first couple of weeks of the Ret rework, people were crying nerf Ret everywhere. Likely Havoc is going to be in the same situation, but we're of course not judging based on that. With the addition of the talent tree reworks, Havoc have a lot more tankiness, which was a problem in current Mythic Plus. Access to tools is way better implemented. You get Fel Eruption baseline, and all of that stuff will essentially make Havoc once again really good for Mythic Plus, because if you remember, prior to Dragonflight, Havoc was always meta for Mythic Plus. Might not have been god comp material, but it was at least A tier for years, and we predict this will bring it all the way up to S tier. And speaking of S tier, Balanced Druid is also going into S tier, probably doing a little bit better than Havoc. From what we've seen so far, the damage that it can do is pretty high up. Actually, it's just slightly above Unholy, which I think we might have placed Unholy a little bit too low. I think I'm changing my mind and putting Unholy a little bit higher, because the damage is below Balance, but it's a lot higher. And speaking of Balance, we have seen Balance actually doing a lot of damage. And of course, Balance has been kind of a meta spec this entire expansion. Nothing nothing really fundamentally changes for balance to take away that spot, with the exception of augmentation nerfs, and we will get to augmentation eventually. And just to clarify and to chill all the nerds in the comments, all of the logs that we have looked at and studied for this tier list did not include a single augmentation, outside of the augmentation logs, of course, that we had for the respective spec. But all of these specs in terms of their performance, and you can see on the screen over the course of this video as we're showing you some samples of damage, obviously some of the best, because we know we kind of need to draw the line somewhere. They don't include any augmentation of any kind during these dungeon runs. And similar with balance, Feral is doing a lot better as well, and we predict is going to be A tier material, where in terms of damage, it's overall close to Unholy DK, very similar in terms of overall performance. I've personally played Feral as well with the new tier set, and it is fantastic. Having a burst window of 30 seconds to a minute is crazy good. Not to mention it's fun, but it's actually really good for Mythic Plus, since Feral Frenzy is on a 30-second cooldown, meaning that if you do low keys, you're going to be doing very good because things die faster, but you have access to burst a lot more often. Plus, if you do end up playing Convoke, which is what I tested it with, which is what is theory crafted to be good with Feral in 10.2, then you're going to have cooldowns for every pack, at least in the hierarchies, where it will start to matter when we form the meta. Now, once again, there is always the argument that, well, if balance is just way better than Feral, likely a lot fewer people will play Feral, but if you do decide to play Feral, you're likely going to be around A tier-ish, is what we predict. Not so much with Devastation, however. No matter how much we want to look at Devastation, first of all, it has steep competition with Augmentation, so even with that, Devastation isn't performing very well, at least in the logs that we have had access to, because not everybody's making their logs public. A lot of people are probably keeping them private to probably theory craft properly, form guides properly, maybe hide potential power behind certain specs. But as far as we've seen, Devastation is barely breaking the 100Ks overall in terms of log overall damage. Once again, at 440 level with a new tier set, it's not looking too hot. I think and I really hope that specs C tier and below do get a buff in 10.2, but they will probably have at least some number tuning moving forward, which is something that we've seen, for instance, for Beast Mastery. And Beast Mastery has received one of the better tier sets out there that actually really work very, very, very well for their overall performance. So much so that I'm hesitant in putting it into S tier, but I do believe they don't have what it takes to be S tier material. The tier set is really good, probably the top of A tier, because it definitely works, essentially makes all the pets work with Kill Command and Beast Cleave. It has been kind of touched a little bit. Call of the Wild still kind of needs maybe a little bit more power, but overall, their tankiness hasn't been addressed yet, which is why I think it might not be S tier material, since Hunters just die really, really easily in Mythic Plus. Unfortunately, that is still the situation, which is something that Havoc has had addressed, by the way, and it sounds making it a little bit more tanky and have access to better defensives. Not something that has been addressed with Beast Mastery. Otherwise, by pure damage potential, it's as high as Balanced Druid. But listen, it is what it is, and that is essentially what marksman players are essentially telling themselves in the mirror when they go to the bathroom to try to convince themselves that it's okay to play marksmanship, even though it is a D tier spec. It is horrible. It is right now kind of spoiling the rest of the tier list. The worst performing spec in Mythic Plus, very closely with Devastation though. However, marksmanship suffers a little bit more because Beast Mastery is doing a lot better, and survival is not too shabby. We'll get to that in a second as well. But marksmanship, it just doesn't have anything going for it, my dude. It's just a bad spec to play. You're already behind the other hunter specs since you're not using a pet, so you don't have access to Bloodlust, for instance, which you're gonna have to be forced into if you don't have a Bloodlust class. Obviously, when it comes to pushing the top of the meta with the God tier comps and all of that, you're probably going to have Bloodlust some other way, and it still has all the other issues which haven't been addressed in terms of its tier set is not even that great, to be honest. I overestimated it heavily when it came out, and it definitely shows in the overall performance that we've been able to test. Survival is probably what's going to keep marksmanship at the end of its ropes, because survival is cranking, man. Now, I would want to put it in front of Havoc because based on just performance, there are some survival logs that are just crushing it. I think the highest I've seen up to this day was an overall 182 DPS finish, which is very, very, very high for 440s, especially in the PTR where everybody's just testing with a lot of bugs. The tier set is good. It doesn't feel like the tier set is overpowered, but it does add a lot of damage. And what else can I say? It's a hunter, brings all the hunter utility. The only reason why I probably wouldn't see it being better than Havoc is because, once again, hunter is just a very, very squishy spec / class, and I don't see that being resolved. Well, unless it's resolved, then Hunter is kind of like at the cusp of falling into A tier, survival that is. Not Arcane though. Arcane is keeping Devastation Company down into C tier rather. Arcane is also doing very, very, very poorly, rivaling marksmanship in some of the lowest damage output, period. However, there is a caveat with Arcane, is that Arcane relies a lot on setup and execution, and whenever you're testing new dungeons from the new Mythic Plus pool, you're likely not gonna have your rotation and gameplay optimized. So very likely the logs that we've been able to see from Arcane that saw it at about 88k overall compared to everybody else, or probably not the best logs, and definitely not the logs that you will probably see, or your overall damage will be seen once 10.2 launches, since by then, you know, people will kind of figure out how to play Arcane in the new season. Fire, well, this is not how I want to be right, but I guess I was right. Fire has dropped in terms of where we predict it's going to be, but we can always be wrong because we looked essentially at Fire outside of Augmentation Evoker, and I think most of the logs that we've seen of Fire weren't even with Shadow Priests. Not everybody has access to all of the ideal comps on the PTR, which is probably more reflective of the overall PUG experience, or people that don't have like a pre-made to do dungeons with, and Fire was sitting at 122k overall, so kind of similar to Frost DK. It's not bad, but it's definitely not God comp anymore, which is what I kind of expected it to be without, you know, the pumps from Augmentation and Shadow. Obviously, it's getting its tier set, which the power of the tier sets is still being tuned in and out, so it could be A tier. I would be surprised to find it in this tier outside of major, first of all, changes, or essentially just very, very optimized play, because fundamentally, Fire just works really well with Power Infusion and Augmentation Evoker, and those situations might see Fire into S tier, but right now I'm just looking at the classes that essentially don't play with simps. You know, I mean, you know what I mean? That's what I mean. Frost, on the other hand, is actually doing slightly better than Fire, which, I mean, it might not say much to you since I'm still going to be putting it into B tier, but it's doing a lot better than Fire, where Fire was kind of finishing about 120k's overall in keys. Some of the best Fires, by the way, that I've been able to see. I couldn't realistically find better logs unless they were unlisted or unless I just missed one for some reason, but Frost was doing about 10% more overall damage, which is saying something considering Frost is significantly behind Fire now, and now it's going to be ahead of Fire in the next patch, and it's obviously providing all the mage toolkit that you essentially want. Whether or not its damage profile is essentially good, because realistically Fire is probably better suited for Mythic Plus in terms of how it accesses its kit, in terms of how quickly you get combustion and all of that stuff. But if the raw damage is just bigger on Frost, maybe we'll see more Frost Mage next year. At least we will predict it to be so. Windwalker is not doing too great, which once again, it might not say much considering that I'm putting it into B tier, but this is a very, very generous B tier. We've been hard pressed to find consistent good logs of Windwalkers. There were some like exceptional cookies out there, some snowflakes that can really take out the damage out of Windwalkers, but the majority of the logs that we've seen outside of the 141 overall finish that we've seen from Windwalker have been incredibly low, and obviously not everybody plays like the best Windwalker out there. Overall, it's probably still going to be good. The tier set doesn't really spark any interest for people in Windwalker. It's kind of being tuned, and it looks like Windwalker might need more tuning before the patch launches out. Now, Ret Paladin is consistently super good, dude. I am so happy to put Ret into A tier. The tier set is actually way better. Now, in terms of overall power and damage, it's not very obvious that it can be better than what it is now, because right now in the current season, it's kind of still A tier-ish, and it's not quite S tier. I mean, it's doing really well in terms of overall damage dealt. I mean, it's kind of bridging all the way up to like 160k's, which is close to being S tier. I don't really see it S tier, although it could be S tier. I feel like Survival and Havoc are doing slightly better, and it's going to be hard to see Ret as meta, considering that likely Holy Paladin might still be meta, but we don't know yet. We'll see. If Holy Paladin and Pro Paladin fall really low, we might see Ret jumping a tier up just because of that Paladin power that it can bring to a group. Shadow Priest is kind of difficult to rank. I want to put it into A tier. It could be S tier comp. Overall, shadow damage is just okay. It's a lot lower than what we can see from the A tier here, but it does bring the priest utility. It does bring power infusion, it does bring mass dispel, even though some of these things have been nerfed, especially mass dispel. So we know that, but the priest utility kit is just so good that shadow will probably be taken into high keys, even though its damage is probably lower than what we expect from A tier specs to do. Assassination. Oh, so obviously the rogue has gone through a big rework. Assassination is currently B tier, and that's not necessarily to say that it's, you know, average. Its damage still needs a little bit of tweaking, but its kit is a lot better. It doesn't seem to have as many issues, or almost any issues. It's still wonky in AoE, but it's a lot better in AoE, and it's looking like it's gonna have access to a lot more tools to deal with different types of encounters, where you can have priority damage to splash over in AoE, or you can have just pure AoE damage, whatever you want. That's actually good for a DPS to have that access to those kinds of toolkits. The numbers are still probably going to be tweaked, because even though we've been doing dungeons with Whisper and he has some amazing performance on Assassination, you can see right now on the screen, it's kind of similar to Windwalker, where Whisper is one of the very few Assassination Rogues that can really crush it right now, at least on the PTR. He's a good Assassination Rogue, period. But we don't see that many people doing a lot of good with the current Assassination. It's probably because the spec is kind of new, as opposed to Windwalker, which is why it's ranked higher than Windwalker, still in B tier, but higher. I am seeing that whenever people start to figure out the new Assassination, they're probably going to be doing a lot better, maybe even A tier material, but it's definitely going to need a lot more power. Unlike Assassination, Outlaw is God tier. Now, I know that Outlaw is slightly broken in terms of its overall damage. Now, we haven't seen significant nerfs to Outlaw yet. There might be. It would make sense for there to be nerfs. However, with the changes to the talent and the kit, Outlaw has always had really good, let's say, a really good identity or place in a Mythic Plus group because of how it's designed and how it has access to its damage. The only thing that held it back behind, let's say, Sub, this entire expansion, was mostly its overall damage performance. Because, I mean, if Sub brings the same kit and it does more damage, you'd probably just bring a Sub, right? But Outlaw seeing right now to be on better and better shores, it's doing a lot more damage. Even if it would be nerfed, and it probably will be nerfed, I barely see it going down S tier, because I think Outlaw has the best overall numbers right now. It's doing about 200k AoE overall, no more. I've seen a log with a couple of Outlaws. One was doing 200k and one was doing 280k. That was nuts, dude. And that was without an augmentation. Sure, it's gonna get nerfed, but it's not gonna be cut down by 50%. That's just too much of a big nerf. It's likely going to be tuned down. It's probably gonna be good for a few weeks while it's getting adjusted. Subtlety is seeing kind of similar grounds to Assassination. Now, in terms of overall performance on the PTR, we haven't seen Sub really shine that much. It's good, it's still very solid, but it has been receiving buffs over the last couple of weeks, likely more buffs to come, which is why we're pretty hopeful for Assassination as well. And right now is just good, but this is kind of how Subtlety always goes into the PTR, and we kind of always, well, not always, but most of the time predict it's gonna be average when it instead is gonna be cranking. And I kind of want to say, listen, I don't want to make that same mistake again and put Subtlety back into S tier, but I mean, I just wouldn't be honest to the data that we have, and it's likely going to be better. But seeing as how Outlaw is S tier, I'm pretty confident leaving Sub in B tier, because usually there's one rogue spec that is crushing it, and right now Outlaw is just outshining both of these. Elemental is surprisingly good also, slightly better than the other ones, and it's all the way into A tier. It's cranking, and Elemental has been receiving nerfs for a couple of weeks straight. Now, I hope they don't constantly keep nerfing it, because Elemental is not an easy spec. Listen, if Elemental ends up being meta, it has its place deserved, okay? Elemental is hard to play and you have to juggle a lot, plus its utility kit is, I mean, it's good. I don't know if it's the best for Mythic Plus. Sure, it has Poison Cleansing Totem and things like that, but that wouldn't be something unique to just Elemental. Obviously, Enhancement has that as well, and Enhancement has outshone Elemental this entire time, and it kind of still does it still right now. It's slightly better than Elemental in terms of overall performance. The kit that they bring is pretty similar. Obviously, Enhancement has the benefit of bringing Wind Fury. Now, whether or not Wind Fury is going to be a thing in 10.2 with the new talent builds that we're going to see from Enhancement remains to be seen. I mean, there are some theory crafted things right now, but I will hold my breath until the patch actually releases. Either way, Elemental and Enhancement are doing amazing at the moment. Similar talk, I do want to kind of segue from one class to another, but listen, Affliction is okay, right? Affliction is probably better than Windwalker. I had a load of fun with Affliction. The tier set is pretty nutty, and I've been kind of testing some builds out. I know there's some theory crafted builds out there that you can try out if you do test more Mythic Plus in the future, but Affliction is surprisingly good. Possibly one of the better range casters out there, even though right now it's still B tier. The kind of reason why I don't see it higher is because Affliction never really was that high for Mythic Plus, and seeing as how Demonology is getting addressed recently, I don't see Affliction coming close to Demonology because Demonology is cranking, man. The damage that Demo can do is out of this world, and, you know, as such, it has been nerfed with, what was it? The Vile Fiend stuff that made it deal AoE damage has been nerfed. And it's still doing decent damage. It has actually quite a bit of damage. I've tested Demonology as well. It was pretty cray-cray. And I mean, that's great for Demonology, but, you know, I kind of wish Affliction will see the light of day eventually, because Destro is probably not going to see it anytime soon. I mean, it's B tier. It's good. It's solid. It's Destro. It is kind of hard to judge, and because it's been seeing a couple of changes. You don't have the quick infernals anymore. It has been capped right now, and you're probably going to be playing Dimensional Rift anyway. Now, how good that will be remains to be seen. The overall logs that we've been looking at when it comes to destruction haven't been too hopeful, let's say. I mean, it's doing Destro damage. It's okay. It's B tier, but nothing that stands out too much. And considering that Demo just seems to have a way better time at doing Mythic Plus, you're likely not going to see much Destro anyway. Similar with that, Arms is not okay. It's close to being a problem spec. The numbers are okay-ish. They're kind of like the only thing keeping it in B tier. I think Arms was doing a little bit over 100k in the dungeons consistently, but it's not breaking any new grounds. The tier set is probably still a little bit wonky. I don't know if they fixed all the bugs yet, which is kind of hard to rank Arms considering all of these bugs, and it still has some rage issues in terms of its overall playstyle, which kind of have to be addressed somehow. So I am actually thinking we're going to see some big Arms changes in the next couple of weeks in terms of rage management, in terms of how spells interact, because we did see that with Skull Splitter and Tides of Blood going into the 10.2 PTR, and considering that the tier set will just make it so that Thunderclap is a big source of AoE damage, which hasn't really been an Arms thing so far, considering that you have Storm of Swords for Whirlwinds and Big Blade Storms and Merciless Bone Grinder and Cleaves and stuff like that. Putting Thunderclap on the map is a big change, and they really have to do it right, and it doesn't feel like they hit the nail on the head just yet. They kind of did with Fury, and I don't know if I really want to say that, because Fury is doing a lot better than Arms, but, you know, it's the story of Arms, but at the end of A tier, right? So it's close to being B tier. However much people don't like the Fury tier set, and I'm not a big fan of it either. It is good. It's simple. It's reliable. It's consistent damage with windows of burst here and there. It's basically everything that Fury does now in terms of, you know, overall performance in Mythic Plus, but probably slightly better because it's fewer buns, man. You're placing 2 or 3 buns, right? But they're reliable buns, and when you're pushing keys, that's probably what you want more than anything, right? But that's kind of where Fury is right now, and we're down to the last spec, Augmentation. Now, funny enough, Augmentation in terms of overall damage has done more damage than Devastation. Now, obviously, this is counting its overall buffs, but even with overall buffs, if you look at the majority of Augmentation logs, it's not really cranking the meters that much. But it's very hard. I'm not 100% sure if the logs with Augmentation in M+ put the Augmentation buff damage to its own damage, because every log that I have seen with Augmentation Evokers has had the 1 or 2 specs at the top just burst out and crush. Like I've seen Outlaw logs with like over 300k DPS with Augmentation Evokers in, and any log that has an Augmentation Evoker for any of the spec in this tier list does about 20 to 30% more overall damage, which is nuts. Meaning that the damage that Augmentation provides to the group is calculated as part of the spec that it buffs, which in turn leads me to believe that one of the logs that you're seeing right now on the screen where Augmentation kind of finished 114k makes me believe that it does that and buffs its party, which the overall performance of Augmentation is even bigger than that, and that definitely definitely puts it into S tier. Now, it has been nerfed consistently. It's still not far from not being good. Obviously, it could still be nerfed. I mean, we're doing the predictions a little bit early, but that's the fun of it, because doing it earlier kind of leaves more room for change and room for error, and we can revisit this eventually and see exactly how wrong I was when I ranked all of these, because Augmentation is still looking like it's gonna be God. Well, I don't know if it's gonna be God comp. I don't know if that's gonna be a thing, but it's definitely gonna be really good if baseline without buffing anybody is doing more damage than Devastation. You know, there's some problem here in classes when it comes to Mythic Plus, but there are sadly more problems with Mythic Plus that you can check, because we did make a video talking about everything that Mythic Plus kind of still does wrong in Season 3, and although we might have some good announcements soon, I'm hoping they address some of these issues, because otherwise Mythic Plus is going to be probably kind of lackluster in Season 3 outside of the new dungeons that we're going to test out. So check that video out if you want to know.